In rural, regional and remote Australia, we are dealing with complicated problems, complex problems, and we can't, as a leader, walk into the room and think that we know all the answers. The gold is in pulling information and knowledge and skills out of the people around the table so that we can collaboratively work out how we might solve a particularly difficult problem. And you can't do it alone. You can't do it with one voice. You actually have to do it with all of the tools that you've got at your disposal and all of the people around the table.
When we think of busy people, we think of people on the go, making decisions on the fly, getting their hands dirty to get things done and make change happen. So it might seem odd to hear that the best busy people, the ones who can really shift the dial in a community or an industry, listen first and act second. Especially when you realise exactly how busy our Changemakers guest, Lisa Anderson, really is. Lisa's not just a farmer. She's also a board director on numerous organisations, is a former chair of AgriFuture's Pasture Seeds Advisory Panel, and a recipient of an AgriFutures scholarship to undertake the Australian Rural Leadership Program. Welcome to the fourth episode of our special AgriFutures Unearthed summer series of one-on-one conversations examining the experiences, insights and life lessons of the people changing Australian agriculture. I'm Michael Thompson, and in order to find out more about Lisa's listen first, act second approach, I started our conversation by asking, what is it within her that gets Lisa out of bed each morning to take on the many challenges of leading a busy life?
I enjoy having a lot of variety in life. That's what gets me out of bed. Every day is different from every other day. Some days I like the challenge of using the grey cells and concentrating on things that are more complicated. And other days I just enjoy standing in the sheep yards and keeping sheep up to whoever's working.
So it's not quite enough to just be the joint CEO and chief financial officer of the farming business.
Correct.
Need a bit more stimulation. So just to give some context here for the listeners, I'm going to read out some of your resume because it's a pretty long one. Farmer first and foremost, also chair of the Riverina Local Land Services Board.
Yes.
You sit on the state level board of the Local Land Services in New South Wales, and you're a senior mentor for the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation's community program. I mean, how do you juggle it all? Being a farmer is a busy job as it is.
I think having a multitude of jobs that are all in agriculture, everybody respects that when it's harvest, that has priority. And when we're in a slower time of year on the farm, it gives me the opportunity to dive into some of these other things that I really enjoy. Give me a great deal of pleasure.
Letting go of duties can be just as important as taking on new duties as well. You worked as a lawyer for 20 years in the Riverina there. What triggered you to then make that step to let go of that in order to take on other challenges?
That was my career in my early days. And there was a point in my life where I was juggling too many balls in the air. Like a lot of women, I not only had farm responsibilities in terms of like stepping further into being the CFO role, the actual business of the business of farming. But I also had at that point young children, and we're the sandwich generation, so also looking after some of the older generation as well, and wanting to prioritize growing good people, which is my three children. You just can't do it all sometimes. So stepping back from that to pursue farming was a good move for me at the time, and it's been a good move for my family.
That fixed dynamic of the legal system, they have their fixed operating hours, but I guess on the upside in terms of career development and learning about human behaviour, you must have been exposed to all walks of life, all sorts of personality types, any number of bad decisions people have made. I mean, how did that school you up for some of the leadership roles that you're taking on now when you're looking at people and trying to work out how to get the best out of them?
Look, it was formative. I worked as a, general practitioner lawyer. So I did lots and lots of different things. I met lots of people from all walks of life. And it did give you a bit of insight into human behaviour when you're dealing with people at their absolute worst. So in a family law situation or in an estates situation, You are often dealing with people who are at their rock bottom, and that does give you a particularly empathetic insight into, how to manage people who are going through crisis. My legal career also gave me lots of really good skills, which perhaps not easily recognisable, but I'm very good at reading long, copious quantities of words and distilling them down into a central point. And that's something that comes from my legal background.
As well as personality types and those crisis dynamics, those situations that we're just referring to. I mean, there's lots of other socio-cultural factors at play too. So tell me what it was like when you moved to rural New South Wales as someone who grew up in Sydney and then dealing with the gender and power imbalances that were, quite normal at that time.
So I moved to rural Australia, and I was one of very few professional women in the law at that time.
Roughly how many women were practicing in Wagga there?
Five. There was five of us,
Out of
not all full time, out of about 60 men of a particular age.
right. So walking into rooms dominated by some fairly strong-willed characters, no doubt.
Yes, absolutely.
What did that teach you, though?
Oh, it taught me a lot about standing your ground. Sometimes you just need to stand your ground and use your authority as best you can. Sometimes it was about there's more than one way to trap a fly, and to be smart about how you go about getting the result that you're looking for in the best interests of usually your client or their children.
All of that thinking around behavior types, stages of life, gender diversity, power imbalances, that sort of all coalesced when you went off and did the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation program. Tell me about that. What did you learn in that course?
So the ARLP is the pinnacle course of the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation. It was life-changing for me. It was a 15-month experiential learning program, so 4 sessions of 2 weeks apiece. We were taken away to spend with the rest of our cohort of about 30. And the program also involved some learning in between the face-to-face sessions. But over a period of 15 months, the cohort became very, very close. We learnt a lot from one another. And I still continue to use the lessons that I learned in that course every single day.
You must have learned a lot about each other as well. Tell me, because you get put into some pretty difficult situations as part of that program, don't you?
Yes, the whole point is to disrupt. That's one of their, 5 Ds, disrupt. And so by disrupting the way that you would ordinarily behave or examining how you might ordinarily behave in a difficult situation gives you time to reflect and pause and think about how you might do that differently.
Without giving the game away, because part of the disruption is the surprise factor. There's like 30 of you and you're put into a difficult situation. You've got to work it out, right?
Yes,
And sometimes in very remote, uncomfortable geography.
correct. That was my biggest challenge in the course. Everybody has challenges and we all experience things differently. But for me, the physical challenge of being in a remote location was very difficult. Other people thrived in that sort of environment. But equally, they may well have struggled with public speaking where I have managed to master that a little.
So, as well as learning about how others responded to disruption and stress and difficult challenges, I'm guessing you also had to confront some things within yourself as part of that learning process.
Oh, absolutely. So self-awareness is really key. And very early on in the piece of that course, we did some disc profile stuff. And usually when you do disc profile stuff, it's very good at showing you, reflecting back to you, the kind of personality type that you are. The benefit of the ARLP is that you do a much deeper dive by understanding what the personality types are of everybody else in the cohort and really thinking deeply about how you work with different personality types. So for me, the people who are the exact opposite to me, I found the most challenging to get to know. But the richest learnings came from taking the time to work out how we think differently and how we approach a situation differently, and therefore how in the future I can work with people of that personality type to draw out a little bit more about, the breadth of value that they bring to the table.
Reading the room literally in terms of the personality types in front of you. Some people have a knack for being able to just walk in and go, yeah, I'll get a good sense of it. Is it as Does it become that second nature, or do you have to sort of take a moment at the start of meetings to sort of work out who you're dealing with?
I work in a lot of different groups, and I think that at the very foundational stages of those groups, it's really important to get a sense of who you're working with in the room, and how you actively do that in those forming phases of a group is really key. It gives you some real insight into what is needed in order to draw out the best of people in that situation. Um, some people like a lot of detailed information, and you need to feed them detailed information. Other people need time to think before they respond, as opposed to me, I talk and think at the same time. And so, there's a real genius in being able to kind of like cater to what other people's um, styles might look like.
It's difficult to make that assessment, but how difficult is it for you to control your own natural instincts and adjust your behaviour?
I think it's about being aware of it. So I know that I hate silence, and I will fill silence very rapidly. But there are others I know that really need that gentle pause to collect their thoughts, because they need to think before they speak. And so that's just one example of something that I do now, which is deliberate pausing to allow people, and also by making sure there are other tactics too about making sure that people feel comfortable and in a safe space to contribute from the very beginning of a meeting, and then always doing an opportunity for people to pitch in by calling on people individually too. Um, it's quite an art.
It is an art form, and I don't think the art form always aligns with what perceptions of leadership are. Sometimes people, when they hear the word leader, they think of like the general in command of telling people what to do and everyone will follow. What you're describing is very much about a leader who listens first and talks second.
Oh, absolutely. That is exactly it. And I think that in rural, regional, and remote Australia, we are dealing with complicated problems, complex problems, and we can't, as a leader, walk into the room and think that we know all the answers. The gold is in pulling information and knowledge and skills out of the people around the table, so that we can collaboratively work out how we might solve a particularly difficult problem. And you can't do it alone. You can't do it with one voice. You actually have to do it with all of the tools that you've got at your disposal, and all of the people around the table. I just think that the dominant leader out the front, who's directing all of the traffic, is not the most useful use of the smarts around the table. So that's another thing that I learned in that course, is to be true to my values. And one of my values is curiosity, about not judging things before you've actually had the opportunity to dig a bit deeper into things. And curiosity has served me very well.
How have you then implemented some of those learnings? Valuing your values and you leaning on that curiosity. How have you implemented that knowledge in the real world?
I use it all the time. So I was previously the chair of the AgriFutures Pasture Seeds Advisory Panel. In that group, we worked hard to look at what does the future horizon look like for the pasture seeds industry. So, being curious about the broader perspective of where pasture seeds sat, and not just simply focusing on day-to-day production issues, really served that industry very, very well. In terms of my work now at Local Land Services, there's a lot of moving parts in local land services, and remaining curious about things and asking the why questions has been really formative in kind of working on a strategy piece, both at a state level and at a local level.
So at that local level, you mentioned earlier, part of it was initially building a good understanding of the people around the table. If we're breaking it down into building blocks, is that step one of a process? Is it as formal and structured as that when you start these change processes?
I'm really proud of that particular board and how it started. So, in terms of group dynamic, we talk about forming, storming, norming. So, in that forming stage, it's really important two things. One is about setting expectations about what is expected of people around the table, and some behavioural expectations about what's important in that particular organisation. And so we did quite a bit of work together on setting some expectations. But we also did some formal work. So we did some working in groups training, and that was useful to me because I revealed all the personality types around the room, but it also revealed learning styles about how people like to receive information. And more broadly, it talked to how we might work together. What is an effective way of us working together and communicating with one another? And by setting the expectations really clearly at the very beginning, it's really meant that people felt safe to share, and there was a certain amount of vulnerability in that particular training, which means that the relationships and the communication has come very, very easily. By comparison, I see other groups where a new member of the team, or new members of the group join, and it takes them 12 months to kind of figure out what this group is all about, where they fit, how they can contribute, what's okay to say, what's not okay to say. And so the actual formal training sort of cut through all of that, wondering how we're going to work together over an extended period. And it meant that we could really hit the ground running.
That creation of culture at the outset as a cultural norm then sets you up for success afterwards.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And diving into some of those things about what are we curious about here? What do we want to learn more about? Collectively, understanding what are the skills around the table and what is the learned experience. So I can say, well, in this particular circumstance, I'd really like to hear from this person who has some, knowledge of, this particular program area or whatever. And it really does let you do a more deep dive and give the people around the table more license to contribute in their field of expertise where they do have an opinion.
These boards, as such, one of their big tasks is setting strategy, but there's also a saying that culture trumps strategy in the corporate world. How do you juggle that dynamic, or where do you sit on in that debate of obviously culture is super important to you, but how important is the strategy that flows out of those boards?
I think culture does beat strategy, but don't think you can have an organisation that doesn't have a strategic goal. So, in my work this year with local land services, I've been working on the state strategy, and we talk about the fact that the state strategy needs to be the North Star. We all need to be aiming for the same thing. So, we need to clearly define why we do what we do. What is our purpose? What are we trying to deliver? And so the why question is really important so that all of the people in the organisation understand what direction we're headed together. How are we going to do it? When are we going to do it? Where are we going to do it? All the other questions flow secondarily from well, let's define why we're here.
So in terms of agriculture and some of those organisations, one of the big challenges faced is encouraging farmers to adopt new technologies and new practices. And from everything that you've learnt and described so far, what should we be doing differently or doing more of?
So in my own farming experience, it's the peer-to-peer learning that has made all the difference. So my husband and I were part of a farming group and for many, many years. I think going back 25, 30 years, we were members of a farming group. And that farming group was great because we shared amongst us our successes, but we also shared the stuff ups too. And that's not something you'll find in a fact sheet, but it is something that you learn very much about what are the things that other people have had trouble with, what have they struggled with, what went wrong, and we all learn from that. And I think in those peer-to-peer situations where there's a bit of vulnerability, then you do learn an enormous amount. There's only so much that you can learn from fact sheets or from glossy magazines. It's the learned experience. And I think sometimes farming is complicated and is not linear in terms of the decision making. So each farming business is different. And so we're all trying to juggle the information and how that might fit with the enterprise that we're running, which is slightly different from the next door neighbours, because there's no hard and fast rule about how, what is the perfect mixed farming business. So I guess the thing is that if we are given the information, that's one thing, but working out how we might implement that in our own businesses with all the other competing things and priorities and things that are important to us in the mix is hard. But I also think that modern extension is very different to the extension of 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and that there are so many different ways in which we receive information, and we have to be savvy about how we connect with people. And those personal relationships are really critical to the uptake of new information. But we've got to embrace all of it because our farmers of the future are really tech savvy and, they receive information differently to the older generation.
So two things amongst all of that really jump out at me. One is that it appears that the common denominator between what you're describing at a grower group over the fence sort of level and what you've described earlier at board level is that culture of trust. You're not going to get that peer-to-peer dynamic where you've got vulnerability and authentic sharing of experiences and learning at the farm level or at the board level unless there's trust in the room. So that takes a bit of creating, doesn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely does, and it takes effort. Leadership needs to be visible. You need to be visible in creating those relationships. Sometimes the off the cuff water cooler conversations are critical to building the rapport that you have around the table.
The other thing that jumped out to me was that, when you're talking about how much has changed in the range of media that we use to communicate in extension and adoption circles, I'm still wondering whether the culture of farming needs to change as well, and specifically how farmers talk about their jobs and their businesses. Do you think that needs further work?
I see it. I'm lucky enough to see that all the time. I organised a conference a couple of years ago called Thriving Women for Professional Women in Agriculture. Comes from an organisation in South Australia called Wattle, Women Together Learning. And if you got those 200 delegates together and asked them the same question, they see farming very differently. And those women are the ones who are changing the narrative around what farm women do, but they're also the champions of that younger generation as well. And the younger generation that are coming through now, they are really well connected and they are really professional in the way that they behave and in the way that they represent their industry.
Because the way we present ourselves as an industry to mainstream media, for example, uh, you know, you describe yourself as the chief financial officer of the business or the joint CEO, which is very, very different, sends a very different message to someone watching the TV in Sydney, who's probably used to hearing people that just describe, "Oh, I'm just a farmer," or "I'm a farmer's wife," for example. How important is the change of language in projecting our whole industry outwards?
I think the narrative is really important about that we are professional people running professional businesses that are complicated, and we are providing food and fibre to Australia, and we are in quite a secure food situation where Australia produces some of the best quality red meat in the world, grain in the world.
We do have an extraordinary industry and a lot to celebrate. It is. I do find it fascinating how we project in totality to audiences that don't understand the complexity of what agriculture does.
Yeah, so I think one of the things is rural Australia needs to understand that in our previous generations, City people would have had a cousin in the country. They would have visited the country far more regularly because they would have had, family potentially in rural, regional, and remote locations. There is very much, though, now city people don't leave the city and they don't have experience of what it's like to live in our part of the world. And so anything that you can do to break down that divide is like critical. So there are, like, I see quite a lot of movement around making sure that we get rural, regional, and remote people on boards, all kinds of boards to give a more broader, perspective. And so I see change. I see change is afoot.
So if we were trying to summarise these life lessons of Lisa Anderson in a few words, what I'm hearing in amongst all of this knowledge is understanding people, the deep listening, building that trust, and that narrative that comes out of all of that. You piece them all together, and you've got a really powerful potion, don't you?
Yeah, you do. And I think the thing that I want people to understand is that some days you got to lean in. You got to be brave and do the thing that makes you feel uncomfortable. Step up. And I think that that's another learned lesson from the ARLP experience is that we need action. We need people to do things, not just talk about things, and put themselves forward for opportunities where they can shift the dial and the narrative about what we're achieving in rural, regional, and remote Australia. To talk about what the opportunities look like for remote working, for example. That's really changed the dynamic for a lot of farm women. The ability to work remotely has really shifted things more broadly.
So that leads very nicely to my final question for you, Lisa, in terms of stepping up and taking action. I mean, you've got plenty on your plate already. Where to next for you? What's your next challenge on the horizon?
I feel like I've got some more scope in my diary to commit to something else. I'm not quite sure what that is yet. Nothing has really spoken to me well in 2025. I'm looking for opportunities that I find interesting, where I can make an impact, where I can connect with some good people. So I am open for work.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm amazed, but you're an incredible person, Lisa, and I really thank you for being part of the AgriFutures Changemakers series and for sharing all of that knowledge and the insights and experiences that you've had. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks, Michael.
That was Lisa Anderson, a farmer, board director, and much, much more from Wagga Wagga in New South Wales. In our final conversation as part of this special Unearthed Changemaker series, we're going to put some of Lisa's wisdom to the test when we speak with a legend of agricultural leadership, John Harvey. John has recently retired from the position of Managing Director of AgriFutures Australia, a position he has held for the last 10 years. And before that, he was the CEO of the Grains Research and Development Corporation for a further 5 years, roles that are literally a lifetime away from his childhood growing up in Sydney. We'll find out what makes John tick, the life lessons he picked up on his adventures around Australia and around the world, and when it's all said and done, what's his one big secret to affecting change in Australian agriculture. That's next time on our final episode of Changemakers, a special series of one-on-one conversations brought to you by Unearthed, the AgriFutures podcast, all about the people changing Australian agriculture.